Imagine that human beings come into contact with alien beings and both species desire to communicate with each other. Given that there is no shared language and even non-verbal communication may be unfeasible, some sort of universal method for communication needs to be established. Some people have proposed that mathematics could be used for this purpose, as the symbols and terminology inevitably differs, but the concepts those symbols and terms refer to are expected to be the same. This could then serve as a foundation for further communication. Language barriers like these can exist in all kinds of scenarios. For example, the Dutch word red is a verb in first-person singular form that means to rescue. However, the exact same word also exists in English, in which it refers to a specific color. Even though the word is exactly the same, it refers to vastly different concepts. One describes what an entity is in a certain respect. In other words, it's an attribute. The other describes what an entity does. In other words, it's an action. When it comes to different languages, these language barriers might be easy to spot. But there can be instances where a debate is going on and neither side is aware that the language barrier is present. If neither side is aware of this, then communication will inevitably break down. Both sides will talk past each other without even noticing. In a debate, this will lead to misapplied arguments and the illusion that one's argument actively addresses the other person's views. When a certain subject is being debated, the people involved need to use terminology that both sides agree upon and understand. Otherwise, there is merely the illusion of a debate, rather than an actual discussion between opposing viewpoints. As language barriers may exist without the people involved being aware of it, we need to realize that the actual problem is the words themselves. Breaking a language barrier, therefore, requires both sides to use different terminology, which will then quickly reveal that everyone has been talking past each other all this time. For example, let's say that the word chair causes some sort of language barrier. Some people may say that you cannot have a discussion about chairs if you are no longer allowed to use this word. But this is false. The word chair is in the end nothing more than a label. In other words, a quicker and more convenient way to refer to a specific description using a single word. If this word causes any kind of problem, one can simply drop the word and directly address the thing that this word describes. In the case of a chair, the word refers to a seat with 4 legs and a back for a single person. So if the word chair becomes a problem, instead of using that word, one could simply use the description rather than the label. This will break the language barrier, and if it really has been the case that both sides use the word chair to refer to very different concepts, then this fact will immediately be exposed. One of the most frequently discussed topics between theist and atheist is the subject of morality and the place it holds in a worldview with a classic monotheistic God and a worldview without such a being. From the theistic side, this is usually expressed in a moral argument for the existence of God and the absence of a moral foundation if no God would exist. From the atheistic side, this is usually expressed in an argument from evil or the Euthyphro dilemma against a God as a moral foundation. However, like any debate on any subject, both sides need to speak the same language. Otherwise, there is only the illusion of debate and the inevitable misapplication of one's arguments. But this hidden problem within theist versus atheist debates on morality is that it's not the case that both sides speak the same language. The terms that are being used, namely moral, immoral, good and evil, are in the end simply labels that are used for convenience. The terms themselves are not what is important. The debate should be about the concepts that these terms are used to refer to. However, these terms are very similar to the word red in English and Dutch. It's the same word used by both sides, but it can be used to refer to completely different concepts. In this video I will demonstrate that all arguments on both the theistic and atheistic side are misguided and misapplied exactly because of a hidden language barrier. So how can I demonstrate that this barrier exists? As I explained before, a language barrier will be exposed as soon as the terms in question are dropped and the concepts themselves are directly addressed. So what am I proposing here? I am proposing that whenever theists and atheists debate on moral issues, we need to drop any form of moral language. In other words, we cannot use the terms good, evil, moral and immoral and words that are often used as synonyms for these terms. Instead, we need to realize that these words are merely labels that refer to a specific description. Like the word chair refers to a seat with 4 legs and a back for a single person, the word evil, for example, refers to a specific description as well. But if I'm right, and there is a hidden language barrier, then it's the case that theists and atheists use different descriptions for the words good and evil or moral and immoral. So instead of arguing about the terms themselves, let's drop the terms altogether and address the concepts that both sides are referring to. What I'm saying is that I'm going to do something that is surprisingly groundbreaking in the debate between theistic and atheistic morality. Something I haven't seen done before, but which is so basic and so incredibly necessary. I am going to define theistic morality and secular morality. However, this is going to have some extremely destructive consequences. I will demonstrate that the moral argument for the existence of God is an illusion built upon this language barrier. In actuality, the moral argument doesn't exist in the first place. I will demonstrate that the concept that theistic morality refers to is indescribable, unknowable and inapplicable. And I will demonstrate that nearly all theistic attacks upon secular morality are built upon this language barrier and will disappear as soon as this barrier is dissolved. But there will also be consequences for us atheists. Namely, we can no longer use the Euthyphro dilemma argument. And I'm calling it the Euthyphro dilemma argument for a reason instead of just the Euthyphro dilemma. And it will most likely be the case that we can no longer use the argument from evil. However, these were never good arguments to begin with, and they can be replaced with vastly superior arguments. But before I can go on and define theistic and secular morality, we first need to get some misunderstandings out of the way. Apart from the most basic problem of the definition of good, evil, moral and immoral, there is another problem that first needs to be addressed. Namely, the misrecognition of the what, how and why distinction. Most people seem to fail to understand that the questions what is moral and how are we moral and why should we be moral are very different questions that deal with different aspects of morality. In fact, this is the case with almost any kind of subject, even concerning the subject of chairs. One could ask, what is a chair? How do we use chairs? And why should we use chairs? If people are confronted with the subject of morality but forbidden from using moral language, it is to be expected that they will define morality as how we ought to behave. But this is misguided. This is easily demonstrable by the fact that we recognize certain oughts that are not related to morality. For example, the rules of a game, ways to eat healthy, or ways to best build a building. In other words, how we ought to behave cannot be a definition of morality. It can only be a question about morality, namely, how we ought to behave in regard to moral issues. But in that sentence, the word moral is of course still what needs to be defined. So the what, how and why distinction is necessary to recognize when it comes to morality as well. We could ask, what does moral mean, or what is moral, which refers to moral ontology and moral epistemology. The second question would be, how do we act morally, which refers to morality in practice and moral systems. And the third question would be, why should we act morally, which refers to moral obligations and rights and values. In other words, only question 1 deals with the definition of moral and immoral, or their synonyms good and evil. Question 2 deals with the application, and question 3 deals with obligations and things we value or consider to be rights. Theists and atheists usually argue about the objectivity or subjectivity of morality. However, this subject is very misguided as well. In actuality, there are objective and subjective aspects of morality. The definition, question 1, is an objective fact. Of course, words themselves are not static and differ from language to language, but concepts are not. For example, it is objectively true that there are seats with 4 legs and a back meant for one person. What term one uses for such an object is in the end irrelevant. The point is that the question, what is a chair, has an objective answer, even if one can exchange the term for something else. If we start calling chairs gerbils, we have only exchanged the label, but the object it refers to remains the same. In the same way, the question, what is moral, has an objective answer, even if the term itself can be exchanged for something else. The second question, at least for the most part, has an objective answer as well. When one asks how to best build a bridge, and the definition of bridge is clear, there are objective facts about building bridges. The subjective part is question 3, namely the why question. And not only is this subjective, it is necessarily subjective. Any question that asks, why should we do X, necessarily has a subjective answer. No ought can be objective, and this is easily demonstrated by 4 simple words. I do not care. Any why should question can be answered with I do not care. A failure to understand this is a failure to understand what an ought really is. Oughts are always predicated on an if, and that if is about a desire. No matter how basic or how common that desire may be, it is still a subjective desire. For example, the statement, you should eat healthy, is essentially an incomplete question. The subjectivity of the statement becomes clear once you add the if part to it. You should eat healthy if you desire to stay healthy. Any should is built upon an if concerning a desire, and this is true in all worldviews, including a theistic one. Even if it is an objective fact that God requires certain behavior from us, it is still completely subjective whether we should care about that. Any ought is necessarily subjective. It can only be an objective fact that someone requires certain things from another person, but whether one cares about that remains subjective. So now we have the what, how and why distinction clear, and what aspects of morality are objective and subjective, let's return to the most basic questions we should ask. What does good or moral mean? What does evil or immoral mean? And does everyone adhere to the same meaning? As soon as human beings develop languages, words have been used to describe all kinds of aspects of the world as we experience it. Visibility and invisibility to describe things we can see and things we cannot see. Being warm and being cold to describe temperature in relation to how it makes us feel. Health to describe the state of our bodies when it functions correctly. And sickness when we are inflicted by a disease. We also experience things that makes us feel good and things that makes us feel bad. In general, we can speak of well-being versus harm. When it comes to well-being and harm, we notice that certain actions influence the well-being or harm that we experience. Moral language is something we developed to talk about actions that influence well-being and harm in respect to the intent of the agents involved, the consequences the action has, and how it relates to things we value or consider to be human rights. Moral or good is a label we use to refer to an action that causes or maintains well-being with the intent of causing or maintaining well-being. Immoral or evil is a label we use to refer to an action that causes or maintains harm with the intent of causing or maintaining harm. This answers the first of the 3 questions we talked about earlier, namely, what does moral or immoral mean? Just like the word chair itself is an interchangeable word that differs from language to language, it is a term that describes something objective in the world, namely a seat with 4 legs and a back for a single person. In the same way, the word moral also describes something objective in the world, namely any action that causes or maintains well-being with the intent of causing or maintaining well-being. So now we have, at least on a basic level, the definition of moral and immoral clear in the secular sense of those terms, we can ask the next question. How do we act morally? Just like we can, for the most part, objectively determine what actions lead to health and what actions lead to sickness, we can also, for the most part, objectively determine what actions lead to well-being and what actions lead to harm. Something that helps to determine this is what I call the moral triangle. The moral triangle has 3 aspects: intent, consequences, and rights and values. Using this triangle to evaluate actions, we also quickly realize that we are not dealing with a black and white issue, but rather with a spectrum. It is not the case that actions are either moral or immoral, but that some actions cause well-being to a higher degree, that some actions cause harm to a higher degree, and that some actions cause neither well-being nor harm. That last category we typically label as amoral actions. I also need to stress that defining actions as moral or immoral using a system like this is not arbitrary. We use this in relation to all definitions. For example, there are certain aspects that an object requires in order to fall under the label chair. If an object does not conform to one or more of those aspects, the object in question is not a chair but something else. Perhaps something very similar, but something else nonetheless. The moral triangle works the same way. If a person intends to harm another person, the consequences are that harm is caused and human rights are violated, the action is labeled as an evil action. Take one of these aspects away and the label no longer fits. When someone dies because of an accident, for example, the consequences are indeed harmful and a human right or value is violated. However, there was no intent to cause harm. The action therefore doesn't fit the label evil. But we need to understand that we are again dealing with a spectrum. For example, a person might not have intended to kill another person, but certain actions he took did result in an accident when he knew those actions could result in an accident. This is what we typically call being negligent. In that sense, we could say that running someone over with your car because you wanted to kill that person is more evil than running over a person because you knew your brakes weren't functioning properly, yet you neglected to take care of that. Another way this part of the triangle comes into play is when the agent in question has mental deficiencies and cannot understand what results his or her actions will have. For example, young children or mentally handicapped people. A quite different example is an action where the intent was to cause harm, yet the action had well-being as a result. Let's say that a doctor wants to create a virus to kill off most of humanity, yet accidentally creates a cure for cancer. The consequences are beneficial to well-being, but the intent was to cause harm. Therefore, we cannot label this as a moral action, but it does have a different place on the spectrum in comparison to a scenario where the doctor had succeeded in creating a deadly virus. It is quite difficult to come up with an example in which only a human right is violated, yet the intention was to cause well-being and the consequences were that well-being was caused. An example in which harm is at least to some extent intended, yet no rights are violated, is when the police is forced to kill an armed criminal. Since the criminal is the one with the intent to cause harm, people generally regard such a situation as something that suspends the rights of the criminal. In such a scenario, harming the criminal is allowed. This is sometimes labeled as a necessary evil or an allowable evil, and is usually extremely carefully regulated in societies. Of course, there is an added factor concerning the intent of the police officer, that it was not merely his intent to harm the criminal, but also to protect potential victims. Another very important aspect of this corner of the triangle is the concept of consent, which in some contexts comes down to agreed upon harm. An example of this is a boxing match in which the two people involved intend to harm each other, usually succeed in harming each other, yet it doesn't violate the other person's rights as both boxers have consented to be harmed. A boxer randomly harming someone in the audience would be labeled as immoral as that person has not consented to be harmed. Another example would be when a dentist has to inflict harm to a patient in order to cause well-being. In such a situation, the intent is of course not actually to harm the person, but to cause well-being through harmful means. Usually in such scenarios there is no painless method available, or some similar obstruction exists. As you can see, the third corner of the moral triangle is the most subjective corner, as intent and consequences can, for the most part, be objectively determined. But the third corner mostly relates to the third question: why should we act morally? Due to the impossibility of any objective ought, this question is predicated on an if, which in turn is predicated on the desire of the agent in question. Things we recognize as moral oughts are predicated on the desire of living in a society where well-being is caused and maintained and harm is avoided as much as possible. If you want to live in such a society, certain oughts and rights arise. When I talk about rights and values, I'm of course not talking about any right or value, but about rights and values that relate to well-being and harm. When I use the term moral right here, the word moral is an adjective. I'm not using it as a singular term. So I'm saying a moral right. Not just a moral right, but a right which is moral. In other words, if in a hypothetical society some people have the right to rape other people, then we are talking about an immoral right. Calling it a moral right is a contradiction in terms. Some people may object that the same subjectivity found in the third question applies to the first question as well-being and harm may differ from person to person. However, this is based on a misunderstanding and requires merely the recognition that individual human beings differ. And we are not talking about arbitrary preferences here, but objective differences that determine what constitutes well-being and harm for a specific individual. For example, there's an objective difference between a person with autism and a person without autism, which influences their needs and desires. An extreme example would be a person who is incapable of feeling physical pain and who therefore has a quite different experience of harm than a person for whom harm includes physical suffering. It is an objective fact that human beings are emotional beings, and it is no accident that freedom is one of the most highly valued moral rights. However, once freedom implies the violation of another person's well-being, we are by definition no longer dealing with a moral value in the secular sense of the term. Now we have a basic understanding of the concept of secular morality, it becomes clear that many theistic objections against secular morality are completely nonsensical. For example, theists often ask us endlessly, and why is that evil then? As if this question can be asked endlessly. Eventually, the answer will become, because it causes harm, and the theist will then ask, why is causing harm evil? However, when we understand what secular morality is, this question is like asking, why is a seat with 4 legs and a back meant for a single person a chair? The answer is simply that chair is a label to refer to a seat with 4 legs and a back meant for a single person. In the same way, evil is a label to refer to causing harm. They are essentially asking, why is causing harm causing harm? The question is meaningless. This is where this trail of why questions comes to an end, when you reach the definition itself. And, as we will see later on, the very same thing applies to theistic morality as well, as the trail of why questions comes to an end at the definition as well. Another objection is that secular morality is descriptive rather than prescriptive. Secular moral language merely describes an aspect of human experience, but it doesn't prescribe that we act a certain way. However, just like with the objective-subjective dichotomy, the theists fail to understand that it's not one or the other. There are descriptive and prescriptive aspects to secular morality, which is the case for theistic morality as well. For the most part, morality is indeed merely descriptive as it describes the result of certain actions between people. Prescription is merely another way of talking about oughts, which are predicated on the desires of the agents involved. Moral obligations arise from people's desire to live in a moral society. If you don't care about living in a moral society, and if you don't care about the consequences of going against society, like going to jail or whatever kind of penalty, then moral obligations indeed become meaningless to you. Again, any ought is predicated on a desire. And the same goes for theistic morality as well. Without going into details yet, theists would at least agree that it's a moral obligation to obey God's commandments. However, if you don't care about God's commandments, and if you don't care about God's judgment, like the devil in Christianity for example, then those moral obligations indeed become meaningless to you. In other words, moral systems prescribe specific behavior which is only relevant to you if you desire to live in a moral society. And this is true no matter what the word moral means in this context. Any obligation only has meaning if you care about it. Whether that obligation comes from another person, a government, a biological urge, or whether it is some sort of cosmic fact. Any "you should" statement can be answered with "I do not care." Another meaningless theistic objection is the claim, why would it be evil to only look out for your own well-being? The answer is simple, it depends. If you live like a hermit, then no, it's certainly not evil. But if you cause well-being for yourself by harming other people, then such an action falls under the definition of evil in a secular sense of the term. We even have a word for this in our moral language: selfishness. It refers to people who are willing to sacrifice other people's well-being for their own benefit. And if you harm others without intent, it's similar to being negligent. Remember, morality is about actions between people. When only a single person exists, there is no such thing as morality. At least, not in a secular sense. Another meaningless theistic objection is that secular morality could have turned out differently if evolution could be rewound and started over again. Apart from the fact that this is a very speculative argument, it is based on a fundamental misunderstanding. Since secular morality is a way of talking about actions between people in relation to our experience of well-being and harm, then if our biology had been fundamentally different, then our experience of well-being and harm could change along with it. For example, let's say that in the Andromeda galaxy there is a race of aliens that procreate in a fundamentally different way than we do. Would rape be an issue there if forced sex is an unknown concept to begin with? Obviously not. If there is yet another race of aliens that do not experience physical pain, or a race of aliens that have gone immortal, or a race of aliens that has no emotions whatsoever, morality would indeed apply in a different way to those species, as harm for them would not include physical pain, but only mental forms of harm. This is not an argument against secular morality, but merely demonstrates the fundamental importance of how our biological attributes influence our experience of life, the world, and how we treat each other. In other words, secular morality is very much contingent. When there are less than two agents in existence, or when there are multiple agents but they do not interact, then secular morality doesn't exist at all. And when there is interaction between two or more agents, then morality is determined by how well-being and harm are experienced by those agents. So is rape always wrong in any possible world? Well, it depends on whether or not rape causes harm in any possible world. If rape causes harm in all possible worlds, then rape is indeed always evil. If rape doesn't cause harm in all possible worlds, then rape is not always evil. Of course, in the secular sense of the term. Another meaningless objection is the following. When an animal kills another animal, it kills it, but it doesn't murder it. When a giant flood destroys a nation, it's called a natural disaster, not genocide. So what is the difference with humans? Well, very simple. Let's take a look at the moral triangle again. The obvious difference is the intent corner. A flood has no intention whatsoever, it's not an agent. And an animal doesn't have the same cognitive abilities as human beings have. However, just like there are animal rights advocates who claim that animals need to be included into moral systems, as they can experience harm and well-being as well, one might argue that some animals that do have the cognitive abilities to recognize the effects of their behavior could be considered good or evil. Whether they care about any of that is a different matter, of course. The final meaningless objection I want to address is that secular morality allows for too much grey areas. Even using the moral triangle, it can be extremely difficult to properly determine whether some actions are good or evil. However, this is not an objection against secular morality, but merely a recognition of the fact that secular morality is a very difficult subject. Quantum mechanics is an extremely difficult field of study as well, but that doesn't undermine it in any way. And secular morality is especially difficult due to the inherent subjectivity of the rights-values corners of the moral triangle. Most of the moral grey areas like abortion and euthanasia, and probably even the death penalty, are mostly about this corner of the triangle. But merely pointing out that secular morality is a difficult subject is not an argument against the concept. One could of course spend hours on giving a proper description of secular morality, but I hope that we now at least have a basic understanding of the concept and why so many theistic objections to it are misguided. But the problem is that so many secularists use misguided arguments against theistic morality as well, because they equate it with secular morality due to the hidden language barrier. When using the problem of evil, for example, most non-theists use the secular definition of goodness when they talk about the concept of God being all good. Although some individual theists may in fact use that same definition, because most theists do not actually understand their own worldview, is it really the case that the divine attribute of all goodness in a classic monotheistic worldview has anything to do with the secular definition of good? And does another popular argument against theistic morality, the Euthyphro dilemma argument, even make sense when one applies a theistic definition of good? I will now demonstrate that instead of trying to use the Euthyphro dilemma as an objection, we need to use it as a tool for helping to understand the concept of theistic morality. But in order to do that, we need to understand the worldview of the person in whose writings we find this dilemma, and how that worldview was in opposition of the Christian worldview. Euthyphro's dilemma is found in the writings of Plato, who is describing a conversation between his master Socrates and a Greek polytheist called Euthyphro. Socrates asks Euthyphro in essence if the gods decide what is good, or if the gods recognize what is good. In other words, is goodness based on the opinions or actions of the gods, or do even the gods appeal to some sort of external standard to determine what is good and what is evil? Given the historical setting of the dialogue, we might need to understand the views of the author of this account. Namely, what did Plato regard as the foundation of goodness? Because in essence, the Euthyphro dilemma could be considered as an argument for Platonism, something which modern counter-apologists fail to recognize. In order to understand this, we need to focus on the second horn of the dilemma, because that was the horn that Euthyphro himself was constantly leaning towards. In Greek polytheism, the gods are beings who are born and die, just like humans. The gods are not absolute, and even Zeus was believed to have an origin. Did they bring goodness into being by willing it, with all their differing opinions? Would there be no goodness if there were no gods? Socrates was pushing Euthyphro towards the second horn of the dilemma without having to force him much. But if the gods do not decide what is good, but instead merely recognize it, then what is this external standard of goodness supposed to be? What did the writer of the dialogue regard as this standard that even the gods, if they existed, would have to appeal to? In Platonism, goodness, like all abstractions, are viewed as actually existing supernatural entities, collectively referred to as Platonic forms. These abstract entities exist in the most fundamental realm of reality, and the realm we inhabit, which in this context would even include gods and other spiritual entities, exists as a sort of shadow of the forms, an imperfect reflection, so to say. The imperfect circles in our realm, for example, are imperfect reflections of the perfect circle that exists as a Platonic form. One of these forms, by Plato regarded as perhaps the most important of them all, even almost revered like a deity, is the Platonic form of the good. This is what Plato believed to be the absolute standard that everyone, including the gods if they existed, would have to appeal to recognize what is good and what is not. Being the ultimate reality, these forms were not only eternal, but their existence was believed to be metaphysically necessary. They had no origin, no end, and could not be changed or even affected by anything else. They were absolutely immutable. So what would be a Platonic solution to the Euthyphro dilemma? The answer would be that the Platonic form of the good is the absolute foundation of morality. Something is good if it reflects the form of the good, and something is evil if it is in contrast to the Platonic form of the good. Reformulating the dilemma with the form of the good as the subject instead of the gods would result in a meaningless question, as we have arrived at the end of the "and why is that good" trail of questions. Because here we reach the definition of Platonic moral language. In a Platonic worldview, the word moral is a term to refer to anything that reflects the form of the good. The word immoral is a term to refer to anything that contradicts the form of the good. Or to phrase it in a more human-oriented way, actions that are in alignment with the Platonic form of the good are moral, and actions that are not in alignment with the Platonic form of the good are immoral. That's the definition of moral and immoral in a Platonic worldview. The Christian religion originated a few hundred years after Plato, when much of the Greek-speaking world was heavily influenced by his teachings and when different Platonic views existed. Not only did Christianity have to compete with various expressions of Platonism, but many of the converts to the Christian religion had a Platonic background, and many church fathers were heavily influenced by Platonic teachings, such as Origen, Clement of Alexandria, Basil the Great, and Saint Augustine of Hippo. However, due to one of the central monotheistic tenets of this religion, Christianity and Platonism cannot be mixed together. As Christian philosopher, theologian and apologist William Lane Craig explains,
I can understand how God creates concrete objects, things. But what is interesting to me, maybe more interesting, are abstract notions, necessary truths of logic, mathematics, 2 + 2 = 4, things that seem to be true no matter what and almost impossible to create because they are necessary abstract things. Help me to understand this.
Well, I think you put your finger here on one of the oldest and most arcane metaphysical disputes among philosophers that there is, and that is whether or not there is a realm of abstract entities in addition to the concrete entities that we all know and love. On the one hand, it's difficult even to know what an abstract object is. We're familiar with concrete objects, things that exist in space and time, but abstract objects would be something quite different than that. They don't have spatiotemporal relations with things in most cases. So,
what are some examples?
Well, examples would be things like the number 3, for example. Do you think that there is a thing called 3? That 3 actually exists? And I'm not talking about the numeral 3, which is a mark on a piece of paper. That clearly exists.
There are a lot of examples, exemplification of this concept.
Yes.
A lot of particulars.
Yes, a lot of particulars. And these we would typically call numerals. But does the number 3 exist? Is there something called 3 that is a part of reality? And are there other numbers? And are there sets of numbers and functions and other mathematical entities?
Logical relationships.
Those would stand, these things would typically stand in logical relationships. For example, 3 is the square root of 9. And that would seem to be a necessary relationship in which these abstract objects, if they exist, stand. So, the question is, are there such things as these abstract objects? And what are they if they exist? Typically, the realm of abstract objects would be defined as objects which do not stand in any causal relations with anything else. The number 3, if it exists, doesn't cause anything. It has no causal effect on any other thing. If these abstract objects exist, they would be causally effete or impotent. And that would seem to be definitive of what an abstract object is. Anything that does not or cannot stand in a causal relationship would be an abstract object if it exists.
How does this help me understand whether God created it or didn't?
Well, in this way, many of these abstract objects, if they exist, would seem to exist necessarily. The number 3 doesn't seem to be a contingent object. It would seem to be necessary in its being.
And that God, if God didn't create it, it would still have to be.
Exactly.
I mean, you couldn't go from God creating 2 and then 4 and just never created 3.
Well, not if you're what is called a Platonist. A Platonist is named after the Greek philosopher Plato, who believed in a realm of forms or abstract objects like this. And Platonists would say that numbers are not created by human beings thinking of them in our minds, but that numbers exist necessarily, and so do sets and other mathematical objects. Now, it seems to me that that kind of Platonism is inherently incompatible with the Judeo-Christian faith, which conceives of God as the creator of all reality outside of himself.
So that means if you have these abstract objects, numbers, existing necessarily, meaning that God didn't create them, that is detrimental to the fundamental concept of the Judeo-Christian God?
Right. It would be incompatible with the Judeo-Christian concept of God, which thinks of God as uniquely self-existent. God is the only self-existent being.
So now if we have something else that's self-existent, then God is just one of an innumerable number of abstract or something things, and just God is part of this panoply.
You said it exactly right. It would literally be innumerable. Infinities of infinities of infinities.
Of things.
Of things that exist all independently of God, so that it leads to a kind of metaphysical pluralism that reduces God to an infinitesimal part of reality,
just
most of which is totally independent of Him.
So all God would be doing is creating the concrete objects, which is a tiny fraction of all these other things.
Just an infinitesimal part of reality would be due to God's creative activity. Most realms of being would exist necessarily and independently of God, which compromises both God's self-existence and also his creation of everything else out of nothing. It would mean, in fact, that most things are not created.
And also his freedom, because
well,
he hasn't been free to create or not create these.
Well, I think that does seem to follow, because it would mean God is not free to refrain from creation and simply exist alone. It would mean that God necessarily has lots of company out there.
And God himself would be just one of this innumerable number of things that exist forever and necessarily.
Right, he would just be one among many, and there wouldn't be any ultimate unifying metaphysical source of reality.
So, as a Christian theist, you got a problem.
Right.
Or what do you do about it?
Well, I remember when I first encountered this issue, it struck me deeply. I thought, this is a dagger at the heart of my faith in God. This is a serious objection that I had never encountered before.
William Lane Craig then goes on to summarize 3 solutions to the conflict between Christianity and Platonism. The first 2 solutions are as follows: absolute creationism, which means that the Platonic realm was created by God; fictionalism or nominalism, which entails that the Platonic realm simply doesn't exist. The first solution has obvious problems that Dr. Craig outlined before, that if these abstract objects exist, they exist necessarily, not contingently. Saying that God created them is to say that God created every independent number, for example, and even their logical relationships. What sense does it make to say that God could have refrained from creating this realm, or could have created only part of it? However, there were Platonic views like this, where the forms were believed to have originated from a deity or from chaos. But when it comes to morality, this view would essentially be the first horn of the Euthyphro dilemma, where God himself is not good, but created goodness. Goodness would be some sort of created entity. And if God had not created it, there would be no goodness. The second solution is the same view of abstractions that naturalists have. Numbers and other concepts are not actual things that exist independently, but are a way of talking about the world and are derived from the physical world. Free itself does not exist, but is a word used for describing an aspect or potential of reality. And in the same way, good and evil are words we use to describe yet another aspect of reality. This is where we find secular moral language. But for the theist, this leads to the second horn of the Euthyphro dilemma, where goodness exists independently of God. God might exist, but he would not be the foundation of morality. Or one could argue that it wouldn't exist at all, for if God had not created anything, there would be no good and no evil. So for the early Platonists who converted to Christianity, it was no option to regard the Platonic form of the good as something that existed independently from God. God was believed to be the foundation of all reality external to him. God, and God alone, was believed to be the metaphysical ultimate, the absolute source of all possible existence outside of himself. If God could not have created the Platonic forms, if God could not exist alongside the Platonic forms, and if the Platonic realm could not be dismissed, then the Platonic forms would have to exist inside of God. God and the Platonic realm were blended together into a single entity.
What's the third?
The third way would be what is called conceptualism. And this would be to move the realm of abstract objects out of the external world into God's mind as ideas or concepts of God. This was St. Augustine's move. He was trained in Platonic thought, but realized that this realm of independently existing abstract objects was incompatible with theism, so he moved them into the mind of God. He said the Platonic realm of the forms or the ideas are God's ideas. And so numbers are concepts in God's mind, and properties would be concepts that God has. Propositions might be God's thoughts that are either true or false. So conceptualism would say there is no realm of external abstract objects, but nevertheless they're not just fictions. They do exist, but they exist as ideas in God's mind. So these would be 3 alternatives, and I think the question is which of these alternatives provides the best account of God and abstract objects.
And they are very different. Do you find it a critical question for a Christian theist?
Well, I think this question is absolutely critical, Robert. As I said, I think that it's incompatible with the traditional Judeo-Christian faith to have this Platonistic view of reality. And yet many philosophers and many mathematicians today are Platonists about these mathematical and other abstract structures. And so I think that this is just imperative that we think through this very difficult subject in a deep way and come to some sort of resolution. And I think these are the three broad alternatives that are out there for us to explore.
And your conclusion, using any one of those three, is that God is the ultimate creator and and his existence is different than the existence of these objects.
Yes, each of the three would provide a theologically acceptable way of discussing abstract objects that would leave God as uniquely self-existent and the creator of all reality outside himself.
So forms of ideas became God's ideas. But what about the Platonic form of the good?
Welcome to Defenders, the teaching class of Dr. William Lane Craig. Today, The Existence of God, Part 21. For more information or resources, go to reasonablefaith.org.
We've been talking about the moral argument for God's existence, and last time we looked at Plato's Euthyphro dilemma. Does God will something because it's good, or is something good because God wills it? And I suggested that's a false dilemma, that we don't need to pick either of those two horns, but rather the correct alternative is to say that God wills something because he is good. God's own nature is what Plato called the good, and his will expresses that toward us in the form of commandments, which constitute our moral duties. Now, the mention of Plato brings to mind another possible atheistic response to the first premise of the moral argument, that if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Plato thought that the good just exists as a sort of self-subsistent idea, as an entity in and of itself. Indeed, it's the most real thing in reality. The good simply exists. Now, if you find this difficult to grasp, join the company, but nevertheless, that is what Plato believed. Later Christian thinkers, like Augustine, equated Plato's good with the nature of God. God's nature is the good, and so it was anchored in a concrete object, namely God. But for Plato, at least, the good just sort of existed on its own as a kind of self-existent idea.
But what does it actually mean to say that the Platonic form of the good is part of God? This depends on how one views the essence of God in relation to his attributes. One way is the approach of the early church father St. Augustine, as philosopher of religion Anders Krall notes in the book God, Goodness and Philosophy. Quote, "One way of responding to the Euthyphro dilemma consists in appealing to the doctrine of divine simplicity. In modern times, this response has been suggested by the philosophers Eleanor Stump and Norman Kratzmann, who in turn trace it back to Thomas Aquinas. The doctrine of divine simplicity says, in its classical Augustinian explication found in the City of God, that God's simplicity means that the being or substance of God and the attributes or intrinsic properties of God are identical. In the classic Augustinian phrase, God is what he has. God is his goodness, his love, his power, and so on. If this doctrine is accepted, then the Euthyphro dilemma can be diagnosed as a false dilemma. It is a false dilemma because there is a further alternative, that God is neither good independently of God's will, nor because God wills it, for God and goodness are identical. In other words, the divine simplicity approach implies that God and goodness are synonyms. A less confusing way would be to speak of godliness rather than goodness. Or one could say that God and the Platonic form of the good are identical entities, misrecognized by Platonists. But what if one rejects the doctrine of divine simplicity? Dr. Krall continues, quote, "This is the first step of the divine simplicity solution to the Euthyphro dilemma. The second step consists in explaining how the goodness of various objects other than God can be accounted for. Given that God and goodness are taken to be identical, Aquinas' account is as follows. Objects other than God are good in the sense that they are in fact somehow divine, such that, say, the creation's property of being good, according to the famous statement of Genesis 1:31, God's creation is very good is the same thing as God. This would seem to create problems for an adherent of classical Christian doctrine who would typically want to uphold an ontological distinction between God and creation. So what Krall is talking about here is that there is a distinction between Christianity and pantheism. An alternative account, which fits better with the ontological distinction between God and creation, would be to say that objects other than God can be said to be good inasmuch as they reflect God's goodness, just as the moon can be said to be bright inasmuch as it reflects the brightness of the sun. A consequence of this account will be that it's not strictly true that objects other than God have the property of being good, for what they have is rather a reflection of God's property of being good. Strictly speaking, nothing will be good save God, which, as we have seen, is what Jesus is reported as saying in Matthew 19, verse 17. If one concedes the above diagnosis of the Euthyphro dilemma as a false dilemma, and also accepts the above account of what it means to say that objects other than God are good, one will in effect have arrived at a coherent solution, or rather dissolution, of the Euthyphro dilemma. So now we come to the end of the road, the definition of good in a theistic sense. Instead of reflecting the Platonic form of the good, the theistic definition of the word moral is the reflection of the nature of God. However, we have to be dealing with an aspect of the divine nature, as God has other attributes like omnipotence and omniscience. Moreover, calling this attribute goodness only causes a language barrier. So we'll use a temporary alternative. Let's call this attribute essential divine attribute X. We can now see where the trail of "and why is that good then?" questions ends in classical monotheism. Secular moral language is a way of talking about actions between people in relation to well-being and harm. Theistic moral language is a way of talking about reflecting God's nature. It's the same view of morality as Platonists have, with the form of the good exchanged for essential divine attribute X. I need to address the possibility that some viewers may think that I am arguing for theistic morality having been derived from Platonism, when the Jewish scriptures predated Plato himself. This is a misunderstanding. The issue is not one of a causal relationship between classical monotheism and Platonism, but of similarity and inherent incompatibility. The issue is that both monotheists and Platonists view goodness in a similar fashion, but both views are mutually exclusive. The question whether there's a causal relationship between these views is irrelevant for the purposes of this video. There is yet another essential difference between the concept of good and evil in a secular sense and in a theistic sense that we need to recognize. It's like the word red in Dutch and English. One is about what you do and the other is about what you are. It's not a perfect analogy, as color is not truly an attribute of objects themselves, but an interpretation of our brains, but the similarity is there. As theistic goodness is an attribute that is uniquely possessed by God alone, only God is truly theistically good, because no other entity in existence can have essential divine attribute X. Creatures can only reflect divine goodness, but God is all good because he always acts in accordance with his essential attributes, and is the only being who is the good. Other beings necessarily lack essential divine attribute X, and are essentially like the shadows of the Platonic forms, imperfect reflections. However, when it comes to actions, it might be helpful to change the wording from reflecting to acting in alignment with. This also helps when we consider the relationship between creator and creature, which entails commandments. This leads into the second question of the three questions concerning morality, namely, how do we act morally? If theistic goodness is a uniquely divine attribute, then how do we act morally in a theistic sense? Given that God's creatures only partake in the divine nature, like being created in God's image in the Christian religion, had this nature corrupted and then gain a renewed spiritual body through resurrection, God's creatures will never truly be all good, as they can never be God himself. That means that only God has the monopoly of all goodness. Humans can only be as good as to what extent they reflect the divine nature. The final aspect that completes the theistic definition of morality is the relationship between the all-good creator and beings who are a shadow of his nature. The key word here is obedience, the third corner of the theistic moral triangle. Being in alignment with God is to obey the will of God that flows out from the nature of God. The three corners of the triangle are the three aspects that any action has to conform to in order to fall under the label good in a theistic sense. Is it a divine action? One can only answer yes if God is the one performing this action. If it isn't, there is at least something not good about it. It might be an absolutely wonderful reflection, close to the original, but never absolutely good. Like no circle in the material world would ever be an exact representation of the Platonic form of the circle. But some circles are closer to the form of the circle than other circles. So the second corner is about how well the action reflects essential divine attribute X. And the third corner is about the relationship between creator and creature, which for the creatures comes down to obedience. If we agree to no longer use the words good, evil, moral and immoral when debating moral issues between theists and atheists, a way of talking past the language barrier is to use different terms for both concepts. For example, concerning secular morality, we could use terms like harmful and beneficial to well-being. Concerning theistic morality, we could use terms like holy and unholy or godly and ungodly. It's easy to see how this would radically change our perception of issues like homosexuality. The theist would claim that homosexuality is evil, and the atheist would see no reason why homosexuality would be evil. But when we exchange these terms for inter-worldview friendly terms, we see that both sides are making different claims about the subject. Homosexuality may be ungodly or unholy, but not in any way harmful behavior, and even beneficial to well-being. The theist and the atheist are making different claims about the same subject using the same language, which becomes clear once the terminology is changed. If we want to break the language barrier when theists and atheists debate morality in relation to the existence of God, we need to find the meaning of the terms used in the most popular version of the moral argument. The three relevant terms in William Lane Craig's version of the moral argument are the terms objective, moral values and God. There is a common misunderstanding about Craig's defense of the objectivity of moral values. When he says, unhappily phrased I may add, that deep inside we all know that moral values are objective, he is in fact appealing to the same sense of objectivity we have concerning our senses. In other words, we are justified to believe that our sight provides us with visual information regarding objects that have an objective existence outside of our own awareness, even though this might be ultimately unprovable. In the same manner, he argues, we are justified to believe that our moral sense provides us with information about something that has an objective existence outside of our own awareness, that morality itself is not subject to human awareness. However, even though William Lane Craig usually defines the term objective in his writings, and sometimes in debates, the term moral values always gets treated as if it is self-explanatory, which is the main reason why the moral language barrier exists in the first place. Could it refer to a secular definition of the term? No, it cannot, for at least two reasons. The first one is that Craig himself objected when Sam Harris used well-being and harm as definitions for moral and immoral.
So how does Sam Harris propose to solve the value problem? The trick he proposes is simply to redefine what he means by good and evil in non-moral terms. He says, we should define good as that which supports the well-being of conscious creatures. So, he says, questions about values are really questions about the well-being of conscious creatures. And therefore, he concludes, it makes no sense to ask whether maximizing well-being is good. Why not? Because he's redefined the word good to mean the well-being of conscious creatures. So, to ask, why is maximizing creatures' well-being good? Is on his definition the same as asking, why does maximizing creatures' well-being maximize creatures' well-being? It's just a tautology. It's just talking in circles. So Dr. Harris has, quote-unquote, solved the value problem just by redefining his terms. It's nothing but wordplay.
In this clip we saw an excellent example of why the moral language barrier makes debate between theist and atheist unfeasible. The second reason why a secular definition of morality cannot be used in the moral argument for the existence of God is because the conclusion would no longer follow from the premises, even if the conclusion itself, that a God exists, would be true. After all, the syllogism would then be, if God does not exist, well-being and harm do not exist. Well-being and harm do exist, therefore God exists. The existence of God is irrelevant as well-being and harm and objective facts about behavior that influences well-being and harm are present in a hypothetical world with a God as well as one without it. Even if a God exists, then harm and well-being are contingent upon the experiences of conscious beings who are capable of experiencing well-being and harm, and not specifically on a God. In fact, would a God even be capable of experiencing harm and well-being? A desperate defense could be to claim that the existence of conscious beings as well as the existence of well-being and harm are contingent upon a God, but then you aren't defending the moral argument but retreating to the cosmological argument. When we understand that the term objective moral values is used as a label for a divine attribute, the connection between the first and second premise becomes apparent. 1. If God, the divine being, does not exist, essential divine attribute X does not exist. 2. Essential divine attribute X does exist. 3. Therefore, God exists. Now we can see that the moral argument is in fact a valid argument in the sense that the conclusion follows from the premises. After all, if there is no divine being, then no attribute that is uniquely divine could exist as an inevitable consequence. But even though this argument is valid, can it still be used to demonstrate God's existence? No, it cannot. As I've stated before, the moral argument is an illusion built upon the language barrier. This becomes clear when we understand what kind of God concept the term God refers to in the moral argument. Craig isn't talking about any God concept, but the classical monotheistic God concept, in which being the standard of goodness is already in the definition itself. Recognizing this quote-unquote objective goodness is not something that points towards God, but is a recognition of God's nature. This makes the argument circular, as the conclusion is built into the second premise. Since the divine nature in the monotheistic sense of the term can by definition only be the nature of a single being, the nature of God is equal to the being of God. In other words, when scraped down to its bare essence, without the cloak of deceptive language, the moral argument states that if God does not exist, then God does not exist. However, God does exist, therefore God exists. The argument has no actual premise that points towards God as the conclusion, but has the supposed objective recognition of his very being as a premise. The great irony here is that William Lane Craig's moral argument is no different than this argument from personal experience and suffers from the same fundamental flaw, which I will discuss later on. So as a means of demonstrating God's existence, the concept of theistic morality is effectively useless, as the argument from objective moral values is in fact the argument from God's nature. It's explicitly circular, which is only concealed by the language barrier. One could just as well exchange this supposed divine attribute for another like omnipotence or omniscience. But while theistic morality might be useless for demonstrating God's existence, what about the concept itself within a theistic worldview? There are generally two methods proposed by apologists by which one can find out about the content of divine goodness: experience and religious scriptures. I'll deal with religious scriptures later on. When it comes to experience, some apologists may object that I made my previous conclusion too fast and that the existence of divine goodness can be demonstrated through the type of experience William Lane Craig is talking about when defending his second premise. But this is false, as mere experience cannot tell us the nature, origin or cause of whatever it is we experience, which is the same reason why religious experience cannot be used to demonstrate the existence of God even on a personal level. This is not special pleading, as it is true of all our experiences. If someone only knows about lightning from personal experience, perhaps even having been struck by it and surviving, that person may be familiar with what lightning is like, how it looks, how it feels, what effects it may have, but it doesn't lead to an understanding of the constituents of lightning, the origin of lightning, or what causes this phenomenon. In the same way, even if we have some sort of innate sense of right and wrong, our moral experience cannot be used to indicate that we are experiencing something of supernatural nature or origin, let alone a specific divine attribute. Moreover, the apologist would also have to demonstrate that this moral sense isn't merely pointing towards a recognition of harm and well-being, which actually has a demonstrable biological explanation and origin. In fact, when one tries to come up with a supposed objective moral fact, it always seems to come down to an example of extreme suffering, incredible malicious intent, and grotesque violation of rights and values with no regard for consent. Examples like torturing for fun or extreme forms of genocide. Our moral experience makes sense in light of secular morality, but it's pretty much useless for the concept of theistic morality.
Welcome to the 1 Minute Apologist. If you had 1 minute to be able to unpack for the audience, we interview the world's leading apologists to provide credible answers to curious questions. What is Euthyphro's dilemma?
Well, that's a dilemma posed in one of Plato's dialogues to people who say that goodness, moral value, is based in the gods. Socrates asks Euthyphro, do the gods will something because it is good, or is something good because the gods will it? If you say that the gods will something because it's good, then the good is independent of the gods. It's not dependent on them at all. But if you say that the good is whatever the gods will, then that seems to be an example of might makes right. They could have declared something totally different to be the good. And so it makes good and evil arbitrary, which seems wrong. And this dilemma is often pressed against those who believe that goodness and moral value is grounded by God. I think, however, that the Euthyphro dilemma is a false dilemma because there's a third alternative. It's not the case that God's will something because it is good, nor is it the case that something is good just because God wills it. Rather, God wills something because He is good. That is to say, it is God's own nature which determines what is the good. God is by nature essentially compassionate, just, fair, kind, loving, and so forth. And because He is good, His commandments to us reflect necessarily His nature. And therefore the commandments of God and our moral duties are rooted in God's essence. They are not arbitrary. They are rooted in God Himself, but they aren't grounded in anything external to God. God is Himself the good, who is the source of our moral duty.
We need to recognize that William Lane Craig is not making a single claim here, but two distinct claims. He defined morality, namely that goodness is God's nature, but then he made a second claim concerning the content of that nature. This is not the same claim. The claim that God is the good is a simple matter of definition, but the content of this divine attribute is a knowledge claim and requires justification. Moreover, the terms need to be clear as well. Is Craig talking about love and justice in a human sense, or is God's nature what defines these terms as well? In which case he hasn't provided any content yet. The problem of the content of divine attribute X is not just an epistemological problem, but a problem of coherency as well. One really needs to wonder what it even means to say that a specific theistic moral value is rooted in God's nature. It's the same problem that plagues Platonism and the Platonic form of the good. I can understand that feeding the hungry is good in the secular sense of the word. But what does it mean to say that feeding the hungry is good is rooted in God's nature? The action itself is not rooted in God's nature, hunger is not rooted in God's nature, and since God is defined as good without even creating or doing anything, let alone feeding hungry people or not, it's not a matter of God being the example either. If one would seek to emulate God's omniscience, one would seek knowledge. If one would seek to emulate God's omnipotence, one would seek to acquire more abilities. But what does one do to emulate divine attribute X, godliness or holiness? We need to understand that content claims like Craig makes are mere assertions. One needs to understand divine attribute X first in order to claim what actions are and what actions are not in alignment with this strange mysterious attribute. In essence, God Himself will have to tell us, which is precisely the claim made by so many apologists. Morality comes from divine revelation. Apart from the unsurmountable problem of demonstrating that a set of scriptures truly is a divine revelation, the notion that morality can be derived from scripture has a fatal flaw. It's the problem of divine deception. If humans have no reliable way of testing and examining God's nature, which is the case given the supposed attributes this entity has, then we have no way of knowing if God is capable of deception. If divine deception is in fact theistically moral behavior in alignment with God's nature, then no claim that God makes about anything, including his own nature, can be trusted. In fact, deception is not even always secular in moral behavior, as it may sometimes be used to avoid harm, like Jewish people lying about their identities during the Holocaust, for example. Moreover, God may be a cruel, vindictive and deceptive monster in the secular sense, but that is compatible with him being all good or holy in the theistic sense of the word. A cruel and deceitful God can still be the good in the theistic sense of the word, as it is a description of God's nature. Claiming that God cannot deceive is an assertion without evidence, and seems to be without the possibility of evidence as well. The claim that God may be a deceiver is a claim without evidence as well, but we are not the ones relying on a set of scriptures, the believers are. Even if God gave you direct revelation, wouldn't a being that is believed to have such power and knowledge be the ultimate deceiver? Believing God's claims is therefore a matter of trust. It's not demonstrable that God would be trustworthy. The moral language barrier has caused a great amount of damage to the debate between theists and atheists on the topic of morality. Atheists need to recognize that theistic morality is a vastly different concept than secular morality and cannot and should not be attacked by abusing the Euthyphro dilemma or claiming that being all good implies the desire to avoid the existence of suffering. Neither should we fail to recognize that secular morality is not merely a subjective issue, but instead has some very objectively discernible aspects to it. We should also recognize that the subjectivity of why we should act morally is a necessary fact that is unaffected by any possible worldview. We atheists need to understand that we need to attack the coherency of the concept of theistic morality and its epistemological issues. And when it comes to a debate on the existence of a God, don't grant the apologists that there even is such a thing as a moral argument for the existence of God. And to the theists I will have to say the following. First of all, you as well need to recognize the language barrier, and recognize that no attack on secular morality can serve as a defense for theistic morality. Recognize that both secular and theistic morality have objective and subjective aspects. And if you want to make a claim about the content of divine goodness, prove the content instead of asserting it. And if you disagree with my definition of theistic morality, I challenge you to provide your own without removing God from the equation. And also, don't make assertions about value X being rooted in God's nature without explaining what that even means to begin with. Claims require content. However, I won't be holding my breath, because when the language barrier goes, theistic morality has nothing more to hide behind than mere assertions and unknowability. Understanding its unknowability and its incoherency means the end of theistic morality.